Fog clung to the trees like a shroud that summer morning, the kind that swallows sound and bends the edges of what's real. Locals in the nearby town said the land beyond the old cypress grove wasn't right, that the soil itself carried a sickness no plow could turn. No one went there anymore, not since the last of the Greevers stopped coming into town. Folks whispered the name like a curse: Elias Greever, the man who broke God's law and built a dynasty of shame in the heart of the southern wild. The house he left behind still stood, half-eaten by vines, its windows black as sockets in a skull. Travelers claimed they could see lantern light flickering inside long after the place was declared abandoned. Some said the family never truly left, that the walls themselves breathed with the weight of their sin. What no one ever spoke aloud was the truth that Elias had fathered children not just from his wife, but from his own blood, his sister, his daughter, and even his niece. His legacy was not written in scripture or stone, but in the bones buried beneath that house. When the wind cut through the valley, it carried voices, soft, pleading, almost human. And in that silence between the rustle of leaves and the creak of wood, the story began again, as it always did, every time someone dared to look too close. Because in the deep south, the past never stays buried, it waits, patient and hungry, for someone to uncover it once more. The sun dipped behind the line of pine trees as the narrow dirt road turned to clay, leading into a part of the south that most maps forgot to name. The air there hung heavy, thick with humidity and the faint rot of something old, something that had been left to decay for too long. At the far end of the road stood what the locals called the Greever homestead, a sagging relic of a house that leaned slightly to one side as if the weight of its own history had grown too much to bear. The boards were warped and grey, windows boarded from the inside, and the porch sagged under the burden of years of silence. People said the land around it never grew right. The grass was brittle, the trees twisted, and the crows perched in unnatural stillness, watching with eyes that gleamed like bits of coal. Travelers who strayed too close spoke of a strange quiet that fell over the place, the kind that made even the sound of one's own heartbeat feel like an intrusion. No one in town remembered exactly when the Greever family had vanished, but everyone agreed they had always been strange. They kept to themselves, coming to town only when necessary, trading animal hides and hand-carved tools for flour or salt. Children were warned not to wander near their property, though few needed reminding. The air itself seemed to resist trespassers, as though the earth had learned to guard its secrets. A few old-timers swore they'd seen lights flickering from the windows long after the house was said to be abandoned, and some claimed to hear faint sounds carried on the wind, whispers, maybe, or the crying of something not quite human. Over the years, stories grew like vines, twisting through generations. They said the Greever patriarch, Elias, built his home atop an old burial site, and that the ground refused to let anything die peacefully there. Others whispered that he'd made a pact with something dark, something that demanded blood from his own kin. No proof was ever found, but no one ever looked too hard either. The sheriff kept his distance, the preacher offered prayers but never visits, and the townsfolk simply pretended the homestead didn't exist. Yet every now and then, someone new would pass through, curious, foolish, or simply lost, and ask about the old house past the cypress grove. The answer was always the same: turn back before the road ends, because once you see the Greever homestead, the land itself remembers you, and you start to dream of voices that call your name long after you've left the woods behind. Elias Greever's beginnings were as murky as the swamps that bordered the southern hills he called home. No birth records, no family Bible, no photographs, just fragments of stories told by men who swore they'd known his parents back before the war. They said Elias had been born in the shadow of shame, the child of a brother and sister who lived like ghosts in a cabin hidden deep in the pines. When Union soldiers swept through the region, the pair vanished without a trace, leaving behind a single child, half-starved and barefoot, found wandering near the riverbanks. A preacher took him in for a while, though not out of charity. Elias was said to have strange eyes, one a pale grey, the other the color of stormwater, and the preacher believed the boy had been marked by sin itself. By the time Elias turned 15, he had disappeared into the woods, returning years later a man built of silence and suspicion. He was unlike anyone in the nearby town. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with a voice that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the earth, Elias spoke little but watched everything. He bought a stretch of land no one wanted, soil too hard to plow, trees too dense to cut, and built his home by hand, plank by plank, with no help and no witnesses. Rumor had it that he worked through the night, his hammer echoing through the hills long after midnight. The locals kept their distance, unsettled by his presence, though some admitted he had a strange charm when he chose to use it. Women described him as haunting, a man who could look through you rather than at you. But beneath that calm, something darker festered. Old stories told of how Elias began to speak of purity, of keeping the blood unspoiled by strangers. Some said it was grief that changed him, others claimed it was inheritance, a sickness passed down from the same union that had birthed him. The preacher who once took him in tried to visit, hoping to steer him toward redemption, but never made it past the gate. Days later, his horse returned to town riderless, eyes wide with panic. No one went looking for the preacher, and no one asked questions. Elias became a name spoken only in whispers, a man whose lineage began in secrecy and would continue in ways far worse. By the time anyone realized what he had done, it was too late. His bloodline had already begun to twist upon itself, binding the sins of the past to the generations that followed. The notion of purity had always lingered in Elias Greever's mind, a warped echo of the beliefs he grew up hearing from the old preacher who'd once tried to save him. But for Elias, purity took on a different meaning, one not rooted in faith or virtue, but in flesh and blood. He believed that strength came from sameness, that the outside world poisoned what was whole, and that the Greever line had to remain untouched by outsiders. Over time, this obsession hardened into law, and he began to speak of it as the family code. To him, marriage beyond the bloodline was betrayal, a contamination that would destroy what he believed was a sacred inheritance. Those who lived under his roof were taught that the Greevers were chosen by Providence itself, marked to endure while the rest of the world decayed. Elias's voice carried authority that could not be questioned. His word became gospel inside the walls of the homestead. Children grew up hearing his rules whispered like prayers: no outsiders, no strangers, no mixing of blood. He would gather them at night around the fire and tell stories of the old world, where families had stayed pure and powerful, untouched by sin. Each tale ended with the same warning that those who strayed brought ruin upon their kin. The children listened with wide eyes, too afraid to question, too conditioned to understand the cruelty behind his calm. When his eldest son dared to speak of a girl from town, Elias's response was swift and brutal. He dragged the boy to the edge of the field, where the soil turned dark and soft from years of rain, and buried the boy's keepsakes there, anything that carried the scent of another world. From that day on, the family code became unbreakable law. The daughters were forbidden to leave without his permission, the men ordered to marry only within, and those who disobeyed vanished before dawn, their names never spoken again. The belief began to consume everything. Even the land itself seemed to twist under it, as if the soil had absorbed the madness. Neighbors who passed by at night swore they saw figures moving behind the windows, pale and silent, always watching. Elias convinced his kin that outsiders were cursed, that their blood carried sickness and corruption, and that only through union within could the Greever name remain pure. It was not faith that bound them but fear, a fear Elias nurtured with every sermon, every rule, every whispered warning that the world beyond their fences would one day come to erase them if they ever dared to let the bloodline die. In the years that followed the creation of Elias Greever's so-called family code, a shadow began to spread across the nearby town. People spoke less about the Greevers, not because they forgot, but because remembering seemed to bring trouble. There were stories always told in low voices about drifters who went missing on their way through the valley, hunters who vanished in the woods that bordered the Greever property, and travelers whose wagons were found abandoned along the old road, the horses still tethered but the owners gone. It became a quiet understanding that anyone who wandered too close to the homestead did not return. The sheriff wrote reports, but they gathered dust on his desk, filed away under words like unresolved and likely runaway. The truth was, no one wanted to go looking. The Greever land sat thick with mist and silence, and those who braved it swore they felt eyes watching from between the trees. The disappearances were never dramatic. A fisherman would fail to come home, a farmhand would leave for the hills and never arrive at his next job. A woman selling bread door to door once took the back route past the cypress grove and was never seen again. People whispered that Elias had grown paranoid, that he saw every stranger as a threat to his bloodline, and that anyone who approached his land met the same fate. The strange thing was how the forest seemed to swallow all traces. No bodies, no clues, no footprints, just a sense of something missing, an emptiness that hung in the air long after. Occasionally, someone would hear something at night, a single gunshot echoing through the pines, or the low moan of an animal that didn't sound like any known to the area. Dogs refused to go near the edge of the property. Hunters avoided it even when the game was plentiful. The few who dared to investigate returned changed, their faces pale, their words halting. One man swore he had seen lantern light moving in slow circles through the fog and heard the faint sound of a hymn, voices blending in eerie harmony. When he tried to follow the sound, it stopped abruptly, and something heavy shifted in the dark, breathing slow and deep. The townspeople convinced themselves that staying quiet was safer than knowing. Every missing person became another ghost story, another warning passed down to children. And though years passed, the pattern never stopped. The land around the Greever home remained hungry, and the silence that followed each disappearance seemed to grow thicker, as if the woods themselves were helping Elias keep his secrets. Mary Beth Greever was the eldest of Elias's children, a quiet girl with her father's storm-colored eyes and her mother's stillness. From the time she could walk, she was taught to obey, to listen, and to believe that the Greever name was sacred. Elias kept her close, closer than any father should. He would read to her in the evenings from his worn family journal, telling her that she was the chosen one, the purest branch of their bloodline. Her world never extended beyond the edge of the property. She grew up surrounded by walls of trees and silence, knowing nothing of towns or schools or friends. The others in the household noticed the way Elias's gaze lingered on her, how his tone softened when he spoke her name, but no one dared to question him. His word was law, and fear had long replaced love in their hearts. As Mary Beth grew older, the air in the house shifted. Elias began to speak to her not as a father but as though she were something destined for him. He told her the world outside was poisoned and that no man beyond their blood could ever touch her without corrupting the sacred line. When she turned 17, Elias held a strange ceremony in the parlor, a ritual he claimed was a Greever tradition. The family stood in silence as he placed his hand on her shoulder and declared her the keeper of the blood. No one understood what it truly meant until months later, when Mary Beth's belly began to swell and Elias forbade anyone from speaking her name aloud. The birth came on a night soaked in thunder, the kind that makes the walls tremble. Only Elias and the midwife were allowed inside the room, though some swore they heard Mary Beth screaming long after the storm had passed. When it was over, Elias emerged carrying the child wrapped in a faded quilt. He looked down at the tiny face and smiled in a way no one had ever seen before. Those who glimpsed the infant whispered that it bore his likeness exactly, the same pale eyes, the same sharp line of jaw, as if nature itself had folded in on the family's curse. Mary Beth rarely spoke after that night. She would sit by the window for hours, staring into the forest as if listening for something only she could hear. Elias treated the child as both son and heir, teaching him the same beliefs, the same rules, as though nothing about his creation was wrong. The rest of the family learned quickly that questions led to punishment, and silence became survival. The homestead, already heavy with secrecy, grew colder, the walls holding echoes of cries that no one outside would ever hear. Years passed before anyone saw Clara Greever again. She had been Elias's younger sister, the only person who had ever stood up to him in their youth, and even then, she had disappeared after a bitter argument that no one outside the family ever fully understood. Rumor had it she'd fled to a neighboring county, married a widower, and tried to live a quiet life away from the suffocating shadow of the Greever name. But the South has a way of pulling its ghosts back home. One evening, long after the sun had bled into the tree line, Clara returned to the homestead. She looked broken, her dress torn from travel, her face drawn and pale. Her husband had died, and her only son had vanished into the river during a flood. With nowhere else to go, she sought refuge with the brother she had once feared. Elias greeted her as though no time had passed. He welcomed her with a warmth that unsettled the rest of the family. To outsiders, it might have seemed an act of kindness, but those who knew him could sense the possession in his tone, the way his eyes softened in recognition of shared blood. He gave her a room upstairs, away from the others, and for the first few weeks, the house seemed almost alive again. Laughter, soft and fleeting, could be heard from the porch at night as the siblings spoke in hushed tones, reminiscing about the past. But beneath the surface, something darker was unfolding. Clara began to change. She started to mirror Elias's words, repeating his twisted beliefs about purity and blood. Perhaps it was grief that made her vulnerable, or perhaps she had always carried the same sickness deep inside her. The others noticed how Elias began to favor her company, how his sermons at the dinner table shifted from righteousness to something feverish and intimate. The night she moved from her upstairs room into Elias's chamber, no one dared to speak. The house grew tense and silent, as though even the walls disapproved. Months later, Clara's face grew pale again, her eyes hollow with dread. The whispers started before the truth was confirmed. When a child's wail echoed through the house one cold autumn night, no one asked whose it was. Elias declared the infant part of the sacred line, his voice filled with triumph rather than shame. Clara spent her days wandering the edge of the property, humming to herself, avoiding mirrors, and flinching at Elias's shadow. It was as if she understood, too late, that returning home had been a mistake. She had escaped the Greever curse once, but coming back had bound her to it forever, making her another link in a chain that refused to break. It was Clara's niece, Ruth, who first came to the Greever property from the nearby town, years after the family had become nothing more than a whispered warning. Ruth was a young woman with a curious mind and a stubborn streak that reminded the townsfolk of Clara before she disappeared. When she arrived, she claimed she wanted to visit her kin, to understand the stories that had haunted her family for decades. The townspeople tried to dissuade her, but Ruth insisted that blood ought to mean something, even if it carried the weight of shame. She rode out alone one misty morning, her horse hesitant as the road narrowed and the trees began to close in like ribs around a decaying heart. The homestead emerged slowly through the fog, looming and skeletal, its boards groaning with each gust of wind. Elias, older now and grayer, greeted her at the door with an expression that was almost tender. His eyes, still sharp and pale, lingered on her too long, studying her as though she were a memory come back to life. Ruth noticed the strange quiet of the house, the way no one met her gaze directly, the way every sound seemed to echo against walls that had learned to keep secrets. She was shown to a room upstairs and told never to wander after dark. But curiosity, once stirred, is not easily silenced. During her second night, Ruth awoke to the faint creak of floorboards and the sound of something dragging along the hallway. When she peered through the crack of her door, she saw Elias moving slowly toward the cellar, carrying what looked like a bundle wrapped in cloth. The next morning, she asked about it, but the others avoided her eyes. That day, she began to explore on her own, pretending to fetch water or gather wood, until she found the cellar door hidden beneath a warped rug in the kitchen. The smell hit her first: earth, rot, and something metallic. When she lifted the latch and descended with a lantern, the flame flickered violently against the damp air. What she found there made her drop it. Shelves lined with jars, each filled with things she could not name, and against the far wall, a row of shallow graves marked only by initials carved into splintered wood. Among them were photographs, yellowed and curling, of family members she had never met, some posed, others caught mid-motion, their eyes wide and unfocused. There were journals, too, filled with Elias's handwriting, page after page detailing his belief that the Greever blood was divine and must be preserved at any cost. Ruth fled that night, trembling and pale, carrying one photograph as proof. But in the days that followed, the townspeople found her horse wandering near the riverbank without her. No one ever found Ruth, and though her disappearance added another story to the Greever legend, no one dared go back to look for the truth she had uncovered. The town that bordered the Greever property had long learned to live with its unease. It was a place where superstition and silence held more power than law, and people preferred ignorance over confrontation. By the time Ruth vanished, no one even pretended to be surprised. The sheriff filed his report like the others before it, stamped it unresolved, and put it in the same drawer that held years of quiet disappearances. Folks at the general store whispered that the Greevers were cursed, that stepping foot past the cypress grove was like signing a pact with death itself. But behind those whispers was something uglier, fear mixed with guilt. Everyone in town knew the truth, or enough of it, and they had chosen to look away. There were nights when the wind would blow from the east, carrying with it a strange, sour smell, and people would close their shutters and pray without saying why. The preacher refused to mention the Greever name in his sermons, claiming that some evils couldn't be spoken aloud without calling them closer. Children were told the stories as warnings, never to wander too far, never to follow lights in the woods. They grew up half believing, half doubting, but always afraid. The town's silence became its own kind of ritual, a pact made not out of respect for the dead but out of terror for the living. Once, the journalist's interest shifted to the land itself. She visited the outskirts of the homestead, where the forest had begun to reclaim the house and the air was thick with rot and humidity. From a distance, she could see the skeletal remains of the porch, the windows dark as empty eyes, and the vines crawling over the roof like veins over a corpse. There was an unsettling stillness, a weight in the air that pressed against her chest. She documented everything carefully, photographing the ground for signs of graves, the trees for paths trodden too evenly, and even the scattered debris that might have been left by previous generations. Then, in a nearby shed, she uncovered more tangible proof, old journals, yellowed and brittle, filled with Elias Greever's handwriting. The words outlined a philosophy of purity, a record of unions within the family, and details of the children he had fathered with his sister, his daughter, and his niece. Each page revealed the deliberate nature of the patriarch's acts, the meticulous control over his bloodline, and the terrifying continuity of the family's isolation. By the time she left town, she realized the truth was far darker than she had imagined. The Greevers were not just a legend of the past. Their influence, their control, and the legacy of their inbreeding still existed, lingering in shadows that the townspeople had learned to avoid and fear. The journalist's discovery did not end with dusty journals or the skeletal remains of the homestead. It extended into the present in ways she had not anticipated. As she delved deeper into local records, census data, and the faint whispers of families long gone, she began to piece together the continuation of the Greever bloodline. Names that had once been footnotes, children who had vanished, marriages that seemed illogical, births that went unregistered now formed a network of living descendants, some of whom were still in the county, living quietly under assumed identities. It became clear that Elias's design had endured far beyond his own lifetime, threaded into the very fabric of the community. Her nights were haunted by the possibility that the Greevers had not vanished at all. She would lie awake in her rented room, imagining figures moving in the shadows of the town, children with faces too familiar, eyes too pale. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle in the wind outside, seemed to echo the old warnings. She realized that the town's fear had not been superstition but survival. The Greevers had not simply disappeared, they had woven themselves into secrecy, camouflaged among neighbors and families who would never dare speak their names. Driven by a mixture of dread and determination, she began visiting homes, approaching people whose ages and locations matched the hidden genealogy she had uncovered. Some met her questions with confusion, others with guarded hostility, and a few, she suspected, understood far more than they were willing to reveal. Records of births that should not have been possible suggested that the unions Elias had orchestrated had continued for generations, creating a lineage that carried his ideology and his obsession with purity into the present. Every lead she followed seemed to tighten the grip of history, as though the past had grown roots so deep that no light could reach its center. In the evenings, she returned to the outskirts of the homestead, now nothing more than a ruin overgrown with weeds, and considered the implications. The soil that had once swallowed bones, the walls that had once absorbed screams, had left a legacy that could not be erased. The Greever name had survived through cunning, control, and fear, a testament to the patriarch's relentless vision. And in quiet corners of the town, she realized, descendants of Elias moved unnoticed, neighbors, acquaintances, perhaps even friends, living with the knowledge, conscious or subconscious, of their heritage. The final pieces of her investigation painted a chilling truth. The bloodline Elias had begun so many decades ago was not confined to legend or the pages of his journals. It existed in plain sight, embedded in people who bore his traits, his beliefs, and his secrets. The town, the journalist understood, had not merely survived the Greevers, it had been reshaped by them, molded by fear, and left with the unsettling knowledge that the family's shadow might still stretch across the very streets she walked each day, waiting for the next curious soul to uncover the hidden truth.